Advocacy Committee for June 9th of 2022. Roll call, please.
Chair Brown,
Here.
Vice Chair Cole,
Present.
Dr. Pierce,
Present.
Joellen Klein, Francis Beasley, Kelsey Ellingson,
Present.
Jared Holt, Emily White.
Present.
Chair Brown, we have a quorum.
Wonderful. I think the first item is our minutes from the last meeting. And you've been provided a copy of those. Any questions about them? Any suggestions for change? Do we have a motion to approve them?
Motion to approve.
Do we have a
Second.
second? Thank you. Without objection, the minutes are approved. Next, we can move into policy that we've been looking forward to. This is our new equity policy. And I know Dr. Blue has been working away on this. Dr. Blue, why don't you present what you've done? And everybody does have a copy or is provided a copy. Good morning. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you. So what I think I'll do is share my screen and then I can walk you through kind of what the pieces look like, and then we can open it up for discussion.
Great.
Okay. So I'm unable to share my screen though. Okay, thank you. Ryan, always Johnny on the spot. All right, so for the purposes of today and thinking about the policy, just kind of what the purpose of the policy itself really kind of revolves around three things. The first being to define educational equity for the district. And then the second being to clarify what the role of the board is in creating conditions for equity from a governance perspective. And then finally, providing direction and accountability for the superintendent related to achieving equity within the district. So that's kind of how the layout of the policy. So you all kind of know the document that we may have started with. We talked about that last meeting as well. And so what you have before you is a version of that, and I'll just tell you kind of what I did with certain pieces. So the first big chunk was originally the preamble, and I shortened that in order to distill it down to just what is the commitment of the board when it comes to equity. And then of course, just deleted the word preamble just so that we can just to bring the policy language forward. And the goal was to make the policy as clear as possible to know kind of what is the action that we're taking as a district for you all as a board in terms of what the expectations are in terms of creating equity for the district. So in terms of the definitions, there were several definitions originally, and those will be moved into an administrative guidelines, and only left the definitions of words that were actually mentioned in the policy. So that being equity, and I did leave equality for that balance of understanding the difference between the two. But other definitions feel most appropriate in administrative guidelines. And then the belief statements, which were a big part of the original document. The recommendation I have is that we create a board resolution. And that was also some of the feedback I received when Kyle sent out the document. I also received that feedback from someone else on the committee that it makes sense to kind of maybe do it that way. Other options could be just kind of for your approval would be to move the language to the student success manual, which is one place that we know that our families and community will see it, or also it could also be in an administrative guideline. So there's several options of places that it could go in order to really be highlighted more so than in a policy. And then the implementation section, I revised that a bit to kind of distinguish between what the board would do, which is to set the priorities for the district, versus what the superintendent would do, which is to execute those priorities. And then anything that felt more technical, tactical will be moved to administrative guidelines. So all of the pieces in the original document will still be saved, but they'll be moved over to administrative guidelines to make the document cleaner. And then also the other piece about that in terms of the implementation was that some of the language was written before we had goals, guardrails, strategic priority areas. So those things can kind of be seen in what context we might need to put those in terms of do we still need an annual, review of equity necessarily if we have our goals and guardrails, and the guardrails strategic priority area 2 is specifically about equity. Our guardrails 3 and 4 are very equity focused. So there are other ways that are more infused in the larger work, so that the equity piece doesn't feel like something separate to the side, because the best practice is that in order to really achieve equity and diversity and inclusion in the way that we need to, it has to be seen as something that everyone is a part of, instead of kind of a separate thing that only one department does. So maybe kind of instead of having it as a separate aspect, to kind of keep that infused. So then the rest was just sort of cleaning up certain language, if anything, just kind of taking out anything that felt repetitive, and added some reference to the goals and guardrails. I added a piece on resource equity, systems language, that sort of thing. So those are the changes or the adjustments that I made to that original document, to the document that you have in front of you. And so from there, we can kind of discuss any input feedback that you have. I did get some feedback already from board member Cole. So we'll be, kind of looking through all the feedback that you all have for us and incorporating that into whatever the next version looks like.
That all sounds good. Good job with this. Gives us a good starting point to have a new discussion on it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Who has any thoughts about this? Wow, it sounds like it's perfect. I haven't heard, Tina.
Well, I have a couple of thoughts. So one, I appreciate the work that Dr. Blue and her team have done on this. It's been a long time coming, as I think about when we first brought this policy to the table and the rich discussions that we had. I am happy to see our administrative team coming on board and really embracing the work that needs to be done to move it forward. In that regard, I would like to see the administrative guidelines. So is there any way that we can incorporate that information being brought back to us once those have been outlined and identified, that we could see those administrative guidelines?
I can't think of any reason why not.
Okay.
I don't know whether they're drafted or to what extent, but I would think we can get a copy of that as soon as they're available.
Yes, absolutely.
Good suggestion. Yeah, thank you.
And I make that suggestion because as we did that work, that was the real key of the next step when we sent it over to administration, was to really flesh out and identify what those administrative guidelines were. So just want to make sure that we come back full circle and that feedback loop is closed.
Sure.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Emily?
Thank you. I'd actually prepared a long list of detailed questions, and you addressed 100% of them in your presentation. So thank you. Like Dr. Pierce, I'm also concerned about, sort of where the rubber hits the road to make sure this is not just a piece of paper, but actually a living document and an actual practice that the district adopts. For me, as we've been working through this over the past couple of years, we did try to workshop and think about the assessment, the accountability, timing, explanations to the public about where things stand on equity. And I really like your concept of bringing it in with everything else that the district is reporting on and sort of normalizing this with the rest of the processes. I think that makes perfect sense. And especially, letting the folks who are on the ground actually implementing this, have that input on the administrative guidelines. But of course, ultimately, the board and the public needs to know what's actually happening. But I think you've done an excellent job, and you've now got a very workable, tight, meaningful document. And I thank you for that work.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Kelsey.
Yes, just quick
Thank you.
question. In reading the policy, it's clear it extends to students and staff. And just the use of the word adult later on in the policy made me think about parent-teacher organizations. Obviously, parents have so much to do with students' success. And I'm curious if our equitable approach for students includes them and a differentiated approach to interacting with different PTOs.
That's a great question. I hadn't necessarily thought about PTOs, but I do agree that any adult that impacts our students in any capacity are a part of the ecosystem of equity that we're trying to create. So I think it leaves it open to being able to kind of focus on a case-by-case basis, by school. Because when I think about equity, it's not just, there might be a situation where there's a PTO that doesn't have, maybe a school that doesn't have a PTO that needs some other kind of support, or a PTO that isn't as strong as another PTO, and there might be some things that we can work with principal on, but it just kind of leaves it open.
Yeah, just one last thought on that is just that I know that busing is still a big component of avoiding segregation within the district. And just if you think about the fact that many parents have challenges with mobility and transportation, that's one thing that comes to mind immediately about how we can, what do they need so that we can mobilize their support to students. But thank you.
Thank you for that, Kelsey. If I can just chime in very quickly. One of the things that I greatly appreciate about this policy is that it not only encapsulates the academic services side of Columbus City Schools, it also incorporates the operations side as well. That does include transportation. So yes. And again, I just want to also assert that we have as much as we have designed a policy that I think outlines how we intend to behave, we were actually behaving this before we even designed this policy. So I just wanted to make sure, to answer your question about transportation, we have definitely incorporated the operation side into this.
That's good. I agree. And that's all helpful. Dr. Blue, were you going to say something?
No, actually, board member Cole said it. So thank you.
Good. And I think the same is true with respect to purchasing and contracting. That our concept of equity applies to all of those activities. So I think that's really good. And I very much like the idea of putting the various parts that were in the earlier draft where they belong. And I think that putting those into administrative guidelines and then making it even more visible to students, to staff, by placing it in some other places. I think it's really helpful. Are there any other comments, questions? You know, I don't want to drag this out, and yet at the same time, we had scheduled this entire session for this policy, given its importance and the history of the drafting process on this.
Well, it wouldn't be me if I didn't chime in with just some technical edits. And I don't want to use this committee's time for that, but I'm happy to, I didn't send those over in advance, but I'd love to send over just a few very technical edits over. So just heads up that those are forthcoming from me. Thanks.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
And I have a few of those as well, and I will send them over. Nothing substantive.
I appreciate the feedback.
Well, are we ready to act on this policy? I am assuming that the technical edits are just that, technical. We have a motion to proceed and recommend this to the school board.
So moved.
Second.
Second.
All right. All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? Motion is passed unanimously.
Thank you all very much.
Yes,
Thank you.
Thank you. Well done.
And
Very
also
good
thank
job.
you for giving me such a strong document to start with. That was very helpful. So I appreciate the work that you all have already put in. It was very helpful.
Thank you
I
for
think
keeping the
it's,
work going.
yeah, I think it's been helpful to get us to a point that, you know, everybody is comfortable and that makes sense for Columbus City Schools. So appreciate your continuing attention to it. Kyle, do we have anything else?
I do not have anything else for today. I'm happy to see the discussion was fruitful this morning. I thought it'd be a little longer, but this is good. Everybody's, we got some consensus on this. Dr. Blue, great job.
Very good.
I do have a request, and it wouldn't be for this meeting, but for a future meeting. At last board meeting on this past Tuesday, a parent did bring an issue to the floor around an interaction with a teacher. And it involved religion, it involved the wearing of a hijab. My request of this committee is that we review those policies around religious expression. Specifically, what I challenge us to look at is at what point is a family or a student obligated to express directly to school teachers and administration the religion of said child. I think in the behavior of how we as a society behave, the assumption is that at some point, someone is going to walk up to you and say, hey, I'm Christian. Hey, I'm Jewish. Hey, I'm Muslim. And we have to understand that our students are navigating interesting spaces at which my family might be Christian if I'm in elementary school, but in middle school, I might begin to explore and change my religious preferences and practices. So at what point do we then hold or determine that we will acknowledge or embrace a student selection or a family selection of religion? Does that make sense? The request that, yeah. So I just think to have a conversation around, because our board policy is very open in terms of that, you know, how can we really get at ensuring that students and families can really identify what their religion is and their religious preferences are.
Well, my initial reaction is absolutely reviewing those policies does make sense. And we can identify all of those policies that we want to take a look at, and especially see how they fit together. Substantively, with respect to inquiry, it sounds like, or somebody identifying, I don't know that we can or should do anything of that nature. No, one student to another is entirely different. We're not talking about that. But with respect to the schools and our staff, we don't need anybody to identify their religion to us. We don't need to inquire about that. And unless we have a strong suspicion, at least, maybe even more than that, that somebody is faking it or using something inappropriately, that might be a different situation. I'm not sure, but otherwise, I'm not sure. When we look at this, whether that's something to try to accomplish.
And I think that's where the gray area in the issue comes in, is that if and when a student begins to show and express their religious preference, the assumption is that staff and administration already know what the religious preference is, right? And so I want to make sure that our policies, again, are open and embracing of all religions and religious practices, to then be able to inform, encourage, continue to stand by the fact that our district is embracing and open of all religious practices, and that we will not tolerate individuals making the assumption of what a student's or family's religious identity is.
If I can just say something to Dr. Pierce, is interesting, because if the assumption, right, is always that everyone falls into the mainstream. So no one has to identify themselves as heterosexual or as Christian or as, kind of anything else that's assumed to be the mainstream. It's only when you're on the margin of that somehow that you're asked to identify yourself or asked to put a label around yourself, which I think is interesting too. Just that, like you said, that assumption that what feels like a sudden expression of one's religion, now, an adult feels the need to police that.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is, Dr. Boone.
Yeah, I mean, as we review this, and it's a little bit premature now since we don't have any of the language policies in front of us, but I think that's an idea we should keep in mind. And if there's some language that helps with that assumption, or directly says not to make an assumption, that may be a good idea. Anybody else want to weigh in on this, Emily?
Yeah, I just have incredibly strong thoughts about this. I don't want any school staff, and that's where the line is. It's where it's staff. I don't want any school staff or any part of the school asking my child anything about religion at all. At the same time, my child is absolutely free to share, if she feels like it, what her religious beliefs are, or whether she has no religious beliefs at all. And as a family with minority religious beliefs, this is actually an issue that does come up all the time, and I think it's probably worthy of a refresher, just to explain clearly where that line is between public school employees and teachers, and students, speaking among each other as free citizens in our society. But I mean, this is a sensitive issue, and I think it's worthy of revisiting. But I think the answers are actually incredibly clear.
Excellent.
I agree with that. And my own experience growing up Jewish in clearly overwhelmingly Christian and Catholic school system, and then going to Denison, where I was one of about, I think it was about 5 students on campus, and on campus that at that time was, I think, about 3,100. I may be remembering this wrong. It was a while ago, but yeah, and I understand those feelings, and I know, for many Jewish students, some want to put it out front, either with jewelry or with in some other way, or their name tends to do that for them, and others want to conceal and not disclose that. And I've gone through both phases. With the name Brown, it was easy for me to do that. And in ways, I liked doing that because then I'd hear things that I would not otherwise hear. And it was helpful to knowing what people really thought. So, all right, we will tee that up for discussion. Anybody else have some comments now? Very good. Very good. Anything else for the good of the order? We certainly don't need to go till 10 o'clock. Thank you all. Without objection, meeting is adjourned.
Thank you all. Have a great weekend.
Thank you
Thanks,
all. Good
everybody.
job today.
Bye, all.
Dr. Blue,
Thank-
great job.
Thank
Thank
you, sir. Mhm.
Really wonderful, wonderful work.
Thank
Thank
you.